bomber is shaking. Not the gentle vibration of a cruising aircraft finding its rhythm at altitude, but a violent, bone-deep shudder that tells everyone aboard exactly what is happening outside. Flak. German anti-aircraft artillery punching through the dark sky in orange blooms, filling the night with fragments of hot metal moving faster than sound. The Vickers Wellington of the 311th Czechoslovak Squadron is threading a needle made of fire, and somewhere inside that freezing metal tube, pressed flat against the cold ribbing of the fuselage floor, a German shepherd is bleeding. He was hit somewhere over the target. A piece of shrapnel, spinning from one of those explosions that had lit up the cockpit with a white flash, had torn into his foreleg. The wound is deep. The pain, anyone who has ever felt shrapnel will tell you, is not immediate and clean like a cut. It burns. It throbs with every heartbeat, every vibration of the twin Bristol Pegasus engines. And yet the dog does not make a single sound, not a whimper, not a cry. He stays perfectly, deliberately still, because somewhere above him, just a few feet away through the internal structure of the aircraft, his pilot is trying to keep them all alive. His pilot needs silence. His pilot needs focus. And so the dog gives him exactly that, pressing his muzzle flat to the cold metal, breathing slowly through the pain, bleeding quietly in the dark. His name is Antis. And this is not even close to the most extraordinary thing he ever did. To understand how a dog ended up in the sky over Nazi Germany, bleeding in silence and choosing loyalty over survival instinct, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to a farm that no longer had a family, back to the strange, terrible geography of the winter of 1940, when two nations stood face to face and waited for the world to ignite. The Maginot Line was France's great fortress, a chain of concrete and steel that ran along the border with Germany, a monument to the defensive thinking of generals who had survived the last war and were determined never to repeat it. On the other side sat the Siegfried Line, Germany's answer, a parallel chain of fortifications, equally massive, equally grim. Between them lay a strip of land that belonged to no one and to everyone, a corridor of frozen fields and abandoned buildings and broken fence posts where farmers had once grown things and children had once played. In the military language of the time, it was called the no man's land. In the winter of 1940, it was also where a young Czechoslovak airman named Václav Robert Božděch found himself on foot behind enemy lines after his aircraft had gone down. Václav was not supposed to be in France. No Czechoslovak soldier was supposed to be in France. Czechoslovakia, his country, had been swallowed whole by Nazi Germany in 1938 and 1939, dismembered in stages while the Western powers watched and negotiated and hoped the appetite would stop. It did not stop. By the time the war formally began in September 1939, Czechoslovakia no longer existed as a sovereign nation. Its soldiers, its airmen, its pilots and navigators and bombardiers had scattered across Europe, making their way west, slipping across borders, hiding in haystacks and freight cars and sympathetic farmhouses, looking for a war they could still fight. Václav had made it to France. He had found his way to a unit, found his way to an aircraft, found his way back into the sky. And then the sky had given him back to the earth in the worst possible way, and now he was on foot in the cold, moving carefully through the silence of a landscape where any sound could mean death. He found the farmhouse the way lost soldiers always find shelter, by instinct and desperation, following the dark shape of a roof against a slightly less dark sky. The door was open. The family was gone, or dead, or hiding. The rooms were cold and stripped of anything useful. The kind of emptiness that tells a story of people leaving quickly, taking what they could carry and leaving behind what they could not. But in one of those rooms, in a corner behind what had once been a stove, there was movement. Something small, something alive. Václav stopped. In the context of no man's land in the winter of 1940, anything alive that wasn't trying to kill you was almost miraculous. He moved closer and found a litter of puppies, most of them already dead from cold and starvation, their small bodies still and rigid. But one of them was moving. One of them was still fighting. A German shepherd puppy, barely weeks old, with enormous ears that were still too large for his head, and paws that were too large for his body, the kind of physical comedy that only very young animals can pull off. He was thin, he was cold, he was alive, and he was looking up at Václav with an expression of complete and absolute trust that had no rational basis whatsoever. Václav picked him up. He tucked the puppy inside his uniform jacket, against the warmth of his chest, and he carried him out of the dead farmhouse, through the no man's land, back toward the French lines. It was, in every sense of the word, a rescue. Neither of them knew yet that the rescue would work in both directions, many times over, for years to come. The puppy, once warmed and fed and given a name, became Antis. The name came from the designation of the aircraft that had brought Václav down, a detail that felt right to a pilot, who understood that machines and fate and names were all part of the same story. From that first night in the ruins of someone else's life, Antis and Václav were inseparable. Not in the soft, comfortable way of a man and a pet, in the fierce, unconditional way of two creatures who have each decided the other is worth any cost. The French campaign collapsed in June 1940, with a speed that shocked everyone who believed in the Maginot Line. The Germans had simply gone around it, through Belgium, through the Ardennes, through the places the defensive thinking had decided the enemy would not go. France fell. The evacuation of Allied forces was a catastrophe, managed into something approaching a miracle, and the ports were chaos, the docks crowded with soldiers and equipment, and the specific desperation of armies that have lost the ground war and are trying to save themselves for the next round. Václav had Antis. Antis was not, by any regulation or military logic, supposed to be on any of those ships. Dogs were not part of the evacuation plan. Dogs were, from the perspective of any commanding officer, trying to process 10,000 soldiers through a burning port, a problem, a distraction, an irrelevance. The conversations that Václav had in those days with the officers and NCOs who saw the dog and told him to leave it behind are not fully recorded. But we know what happened, because the evidence is clear. Antis boarded a ship. He was hidden beneath a pile of greatcoats, heavy military overcoats, stacked in a way that created just enough space for a dog to breathe and stay silent. Whether Antis understood what was required of him in that moment, or whether he simply trusted Václav enough to stay still when staying still mattered, the result was the same. He crossed the channel. He arrived in England. He was, officially, a stowaway. Unofficially, he was already something else, already the kind of creature that bends rules by the sheer weight of his loyalty. England in 1940 was absorbing soldiers from every occupied nation in Europe, building the coalitions and the squadrons that would carry the war back across the Channel. The Czechoslovak airmen were assigned to the Royal Air Force, forming their own units within a structure that was not their own, flying aircraft built by a country that was not their homeland, against an enemy that had taken their homeland away. The 311th Squadron was formed from these men, and it carried with it something that pure RAF units did not carry in quite the same way: the specific, bone-deep motivation of people fighting not for an abstract national interest, but for the right to exist, for the return of something that had been stolen. They were posted to East Wretham in Norfolk, a flat landscape of low skies and cold winds that was not entirely unlike home. Antis was there with them. Antis had by this point ceased to be simply Václav's dog. He was the squadron's dog. He was present at briefings, present at debriefs, present in the mess and the barracks and on the airfield. He had the specific social intelligence of a dog who understands that his survival depends on being liked by a large number of people, and he deployed it efficiently, making himself useful and pleasant and unobtrusive in the ways that mattered, while simultaneously making it clear to anyone who suggested removing him that this was not a conversation that was going to end well. The official RAF records of the 311th Squadron include Antis by name in multiple entries. He was not a mascot in the decorative sense. He was a presence that the men depended on in ways that were not easy to explain in military language, but were completely real. The problem of altitude came early. The Vickers Wellington was not a pressurized aircraft. At the operational altitudes required to clear German defenses, typically above 4,500 meters, the air was thin and cold in ways that tested human physiology and were simply dangerous for a dog. Oxygen deprivation is a quiet killer. It dulls the mind gradually, makes you feel warm and comfortable, and then makes you stop feeling anything at all. Václav knew this. He also knew that leaving Antis on the ground for missions was not something either of them was going to accept easily. And so the engineering began. It is a small, remarkable fact of the story that somewhere in the maintenance chain of the 311th Czechoslovak Squadron, RAF, someone sat down with the problem of building a functional oxygen mask for a German shepherd's muzzle. The geometry is not simple. A dog's face is not a human face. The angles are different, the distances are different, the whole architecture of the snout requires a different approach. But it was done. A custom mask was fabricated and fitted to Antis, and Antis, who had survived no man's land and the English Channel, and a dozen forms of institutional resistance, accepted it with the pragmatic grace of a creature who has learned that the humans around him occasionally do things that seem strange, but usually turn out fine. He flew, high altitude, over enemy territory, breathing through a custom-engineered device while the crew of a Wellington bomber did their work around him and the sky outside filled with fire. There is a quality to the relationship between Václav Božděch and Antis that goes beyond the usual accounts of military animals, beyond mascots and morale boosters, into something that requires a different vocabulary. It was not simply that Václav loved his dog, though he did, with the uncomplicated intensity of a man who had lost his country and his comrades one by one, and had found in this animal something that did not leave. It was not simply that Antis was devoted to Václav, though he was, with the total commitment of a dog who has decided that one human is the axis around which the rest of existence turns. It was that each of them had, on multiple occasions, made choices that defied self-preservation for the sake of the other. That kind of reciprocal sacrifice is not common between humans. Between a human and an animal, it is almost unheard of, because it requires the animal to operate with a concept of priority that most behavioral science insists they cannot hold. Antis held it. There is the story of the mission where he was wounded, the flak fragment that tore into his foreleg over Germany, and he stayed silent. But there is another story, quieter and in some ways more revealing, that happened on the ground. There was a night when Václav did not come back from a mission on schedule. The aircraft had been delayed, damaged, rerouted. The squadron on the ground did not know. All they knew was that the Wellingtons were landing one by one, and some were not landing. Antis had been waiting on the airfield since before dark. The other aircraft came in, their engines announcing themselves from miles away, and each time Antis would lift his head, assess the sound, and return to stillness. The crews who knew him understood what he was doing. He was listening for a specific engine tone, a specific acoustic signature that, in his extraordinary auditory perception, corresponded to one aircraft and one aircraft alone. Hours passed. The night deepened, and then, finally, from far across the flat Norfolk countryside, came the sound he had been waiting for. Antis was on his feet before the aircraft was visible. He ran to the exact spot on the runway where Václav's Wellington would slow to a stop, and he was there when the door opened. This is not a story of a dog recognizing his owner's smell. The aircraft was still hundreds of meters away when Antis moved. He had identified it by sound in the dark, among the residual noise of a busy military airfield, and he had known. The precision of that perception is genuinely extraordinary. The crews began to notice that Antis responded to incoming enemy aircraft before the radar did. The Messerschmitt Bf-110, the twin-engined heavy fighter that the Luftwaffe used as an interceptor and night fighter throughout the early war years, had a distinctive engine note. So did the Bf-109. So did most German aircraft. Human ears, stressed and tired after hours at operational altitude, were not reliable instruments for this kind of discrimination. Antis's ears were. He would begin to tense before the instruments registered anything. He would growl or bark with a specific quality of urgency that the crew learned to distinguish from ordinary dog communication. The crews of 311 Squadron developed a protocol around this. When Antis became alert in a specific way, you paid attention. You scanned the sky. You checked your defensive guns. His biological early warning system did not have the precision of radar, but it had something radar did not have in 1941 and 1942, which was continuous operation at no cost, no maintenance, and no susceptibility to jamming. He was part of the operational structure of the aircraft in a way that no regulation had anticipated, and no commander had formally approved, but that every man who flew with him understood was real. Think about what it means to trust an animal with your life in that specific way. Not in the general sense of trusting a horse to carry you or a dog to guard a perimeter, but in the very precise sense of letting a dog's behavioral response influence your combat decisions at 15,000 feet over enemy territory. The men of 311 Squadron did this, and they were not sentimental fools. They were professionals in one of the most technically demanding and dangerous occupations of the entire war. Bomber crews in the RAF suffered casualty rates that, in any other context, would have been described as unsurvivable. The statistical expectation for a bomber crew completing a full tour of 30 operational missions was not good. The men who flew those missions understood the mathematics of their situation and flew anyway, which is its own form of extraordinary. And in the context of that calculation, Antis was not a comfort object. He was a factor. He was something that increased the probability of coming home. And in that environment, anything that increased the probability of coming home was sacred. If you're watching this, and you've ever had a dog, you know already what I'm about to say, but say it in the comments anyway. There is a moment in the relationship between a human and a dog when you realize that the dog's understanding of you is more complete than most humans ever achieve. You can feel it. Something in the way they watch you, or wait for you, or choose you in a room full of people. Antis watched Václav with that understanding, and Václav, for his part, returned it without reservation or embarrassment, which, in the culture of a military squadron in 1941, was not a small thing. Men who cried at funerals and did not speak of it did not easily admit to loving their dogs in front of their colleagues. Václav admitted it constantly through his actions, through his refusal to leave the dog behind at any point, through the risks he accepted on Antis's behalf that should, by any rational assessment, have ended his military career before it reached its full scope. The night that most completely illustrates the nature of this bond did not happen in the air. It happened in the ruins of a building, in the dark, in the specific chaos that follows a bombing raid, when the structures that were standing an hour ago are now piles of debris with people buried inside them. The 311 Squadron was based in England, but the war, as wars do, occasionally reversed direction. German bombing raids on English airfields and towns were a constant feature of the early war years, and the men who flew against Germany lived with the knowledge that the sky over their own base could become dangerous on any given night. On one such night, during a German raid, an explosion brought down part of a building where several men from the squadron were sheltering. The collapse was partial, but severe, the kind of structural failure that leaves spaces in the rubble, pockets of air where people might still be alive if you could find them before the remaining structure shifted. Search and rescue in these circumstances is a specific nightmare. The darkness, the unstable debris, the silence that might mean death or might mean unconsciousness, the constant risk that moving one piece of rubble frees another and brings everything down. Rescue teams worked by sound, by shouted names, by the slow, methodical process of moving pieces of debris and listening. Antis worked differently. He moved through the rubble with the kind of certainty that only comes from sensory information that humans simply do not have access to. He could smell the living from the dead. He could hear breathing through 3 feet of broken concrete that was effectively soundproof to human ears. He went to the right places. He led the rescuers to the right places. Men were pulled from the rubble because a dog told them where to dig. One of those men was Václav. He had been buried in the collapse, unconscious, unable to call out, invisible to every human sense available to the rescue teams. Antis found him. Antis sat down on the rubble above the spot where Václav was trapped and refused to move until the rescuers understood what he was communicating. They dug. They found him. Václav Božděch, pilot of the 311th Czechoslovak Squadron, RAF, survived the war in part because his dog refused to let the debris win. That is not metaphor. That is the documented record. The relationship between Václav and Antis was tested by the institution multiple times, because institutions, especially military ones, exist in permanent tension with anything that cannot be easily categorized. Antis could not be easily categorized. He was not on any official manifest. He was not drawing rations through any legitimate channel. He occupied a legal and organizational status that was, at best, ambiguous and, at worst, a disciplinary problem waiting for the right commanding officer to notice it. There were moments, several of them across the war years, when someone with the authority to separate them tried to do exactly that. The reasoning was always rational and always the same. Regulations do not permit animals on operational aircraft. Regulations do not permit unofficial personnel of any kind on airfields without proper authorization. There was a possibility of disease, of distraction, of the kind of sentiment that might compromise a man's performance in the air when hard decisions needed to be made cleanly. Every one of these arguments was reasonable. None of them moved Václav. He accepted consequences, accepted reprimands, accepted the formal discomfort of being a problem for his superiors, and refused to give up the dog. The court-martial that was threatened on at least one occasion never materialized, possibly because the men in a position to convene it understood, however reluctantly, that what Antis provided to the morale and operational effectiveness of the squadron exceeded whatever regulatory principle was being violated. Possibly because they had seen what Antis could do at altitude and in the rubble and on the runway at night. Possibly because they were human and they recognized what they were looking at, even if they couldn't file a report about it. Whatever the reason, Antis stayed. He flew approximately 30 operational missions over Germany and occupied France. He was wounded and silent about it, and healed and flew again. There is a moment in every war story, if you are paying attention, when the war itself recedes and what you are left with is something smaller and more essential. Not the strategy, not the geopolitics, not the arc of history. Just two creatures, trying to stay together in a world that is constantly trying to separate them. Václav and Antis had been separated from everything. Václav had been separated from his country, from his language, from his culture, from the landscape he had grown up in, from the entire structure of the life that had existed before 1938. The loss of Czechoslovakia to Nazi occupation was not an abstraction for the men of 311 Squadron. It was personal. It was the house your father built. It was the river where you swam as a child. It was the faces of people you had left behind and did not know if you would see again. The men who flew for 311 Squadron carried that weight on every mission, and they flew anyway because the alternative was to let the loss be permanent, to let the men who had taken those things keep them. In that context, Antis was not simply a dog. He was continuity. He was the one thread of connection that had survived every rupture, every border crossing, every institutional attempt to impose the rational structure of war on the irrational fact of loyalty. He had survived the Channel. He had survived altitude and flak and German night fighters and the collapse of buildings. He was still there, and in a world where everything else had been taken, there was a specific, irreducible comfort in that. The other men in the squadron understood this without being told. You can see it in the historical record, in the way that Antis is mentioned in reports and diaries, not as an anomaly or a problem, but as a matter of course, as simply part of the way things were. He was one of them. Not metaphorically, actually. He had done the things they had done, gone to the places they had gone, faced what they had faced, and come back. The Dickin Medal, which Antis would eventually receive, was sometimes described in the press as an animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, which is perhaps slightly hyperbolic, but not entirely wrong in its intent. It was a formal acknowledgement, in the language of institutions, of something that the men who had been there already knew. Antis had served. Let that sit for a moment. If you're the kind of person who thinks that animals don't understand what they're doing, that loyalty in a dog is just conditioning, just stimulus and response, then Antis's story is a problem for you. Because the choices he made, the silence in the aircraft when he was wounded, the vigil on the runway, the certainty in the rubble, these are not the actions of an animal operating on instinct. They are the actions of an animal operating on something that, if you saw it in a human, you would call judgment. You would call it love. Call it what you want in the comments. I know what I call it. The bombs stopped eventually. All bombs stop eventually, though the silence they leave behind is not really silence. It is the specific acoustic quality of a world that has survived something it should not have. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The men of 311 Squadron, who had flown out of England for 5 years against the country that had taken their homeland, could now contemplate going home. For Václav, home meant Czechoslovakia. It meant Prague. It meant the possibility of return, of reconnection with the country and the culture and the language that had been stolen and were now, with Germany's defeat, theoretically available to be reclaimed. He went back. He took Antis with him because taking Antis with him was not a question he asked or a decision he weighed. It was simply what was going to happen. They returned to Czechoslovakia together, and for a brief period, perhaps the most normal period of Václav's adult life, they lived something approaching an ordinary existence. Prague in the late 1940s was attempting to rebuild itself, attempting to be a city again after the occupation, attempting to hold on to the fragile democratic structures that had existed before 1938. It was not entirely succeeding. The political atmosphere in Czechoslovakia after the war was complicated by the presence of a communist party that had emerged from the war with substantial popular support, bolstered by the fact that the Soviet Union, not the Western Allies, had been the primary military force liberating the eastern part of the country. The tension between democratic and communist factions was real and escalating, and the men who had served with the Western Allies, who had flown with the RAF, who had fought on the Western Front, were viewed with specific suspicion by the communist apparatus that was consolidating power. They were contaminated by their association with the West. They were, in the emerging language of the new political order, ideologically unreliable. In February 1948, the Czechoslovak Communist Party staged a coup. It was not violent in the way that some coups are violent. It was efficient and complete, exploiting legal structures and popular pressure and Soviet backing to accomplish what force might have struggled to achieve. Czechoslovakia became a communist state. The men who had served with the RAF, who had London on their records, who had fought on the wrong side of the ideological map as it was now being drawn, found themselves in immediate danger. Some were arrested. Some were sent to labor camps. Some disappeared in the way that people disappeared under those systems. into bureaucratic silence that meant death or imprisonment or both. Václav understood what was coming. He had already lost one country to totalitarianism. He was not going to lose himself to it as well. He had to leave. Again. He had to cross a border again in the dark, again into a future that was entirely uncertain. And Antis was with him. Of course, Antis was with him. The border between communist Czechoslovakia and West Germany in 1948 was not a casual thing. It was watched, heavily watched. The political value of preventing the flight of people who might tell uncomfortable stories about what was happening inside the new order was not lost on the authorities. Guards, fences, dogs of their own, patrol routes, searchlights. The border was designed to be uncrossable, and it mostly was. Václav made the crossing on foot, in darkness, through the forest that ran along that frontier, carrying what he could carry, and trusting to the same combination of skill and luck and desperate necessity that had gotten him out of occupied France 8 years earlier. He was not alone. There were others in the group, other men trying to get out, trying to reach the West German occupation zone, where they might find safety, or at least find a different set of risks. And Antis was leading. This is the part of the story that reads like fiction, but is documented as fact. In the darkness of a forest that was actively patrolled by armed guards, a German shepherd who had survived no man's land, and the English Channel and the skies over Nazi Germany served as a guide. His senses, the same hearing that had detected Messerschmitts before radar, the same sense of smell that had found Václav in the rubble, were now deployed against searchlights and patrol routes and the possibility of dogs on the other side who were trained to the same purpose for opposite ends. He moved through the dark with a certainty that the humans behind him could not replicate and could not entirely explain. He found the path. He avoided the patrols. He brought them through. Václav crossed into West Germany alive with Antis beside him. For the second time in their shared life, the direction of rescue had reversed, and the dog had saved the man. They made it to England. They made it to safety, in the specific diminished sense that safety had come to mean, which is to say, alive and free and in a place where the immediate threat of arrest or death was not present. Václav had lost the country twice. He had built a life in England during the war, and now he rebuilt it again in the post-war version of England, carrying the specific psychological weight of a man who has fought for something and watched it be taken away by different hands than the ones he had fought against. Antis, who had no politics and no ideology and no concern for the particular shape of the borders he had crossed, was with him. He was aging by now. The active years, the missions, the rubble, the border crossing had cost something in his body that nothing could give back. He was slower. His hearing, that extraordinary instrument that had served the crew of a Wellington bomber and the refugees of a communist coup with equal precision, was beginning to fail the way that hearing fails in old dogs. He was still Antis. He was still the dog who had been found in the ruins of a farm in no man's land in the winter of 1940, who had been carried across enemy lines inside a man's jacket, who had chosen silence over pain above Germany, and found the living beneath the rubble in England. He was still that dog, just older, carrying his history in his body, the way everyone who has lived a large life carries it. He died in 1953. He had been with Václav for 13 years, which is a full dog's life, and then some, and every year of it had been, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Václav had him buried with military honors because there was no other way to honor what Antis had been. The Dickin Medal that had been awarded to him during the war was part of his record. He was, and remains, one of only a handful of animals in history to have been formally recognized for active military service in the way that human soldiers are recognized, not as a symbol or a mascot, but as a participant, as someone who had been there and done the things and earned the acknowledgement. The 311th Czechoslovak Squadron's war diary, which is preserved in the archives of the RAF Museum in London, contains references to Antis across multiple years of operation. Anthony Richardson, who knew Václav personally and heard the story in detail from the man who had lived it, wrote a book called One Man and His Dog that reconstructed the full account from Václav's own recollections and the documentary record. The book is out of print but findable. And if you find it, you should read it, because the full texture of what happened between these two is more detailed and more specific than any summary can capture. What the summary can tell you is the shape of it. The shape is this: a man lost everything that anchored him to the world. A dog found by chance in the ruins of someone else's life became the one thing that did not go away. They crossed a channel. They flew at altitude with a custom oxygen mask. They survived flak and night fighters and collapsing buildings and communist coups. The dog found the man in the rubble. The man refused to leave the dog behind, even when institutions with the power to separate them tried to do exactly that. They made it through, together, every time. There is a philosophical question underneath this story that I wanted to name before we close, because I think it is the question that makes this more than a war story, more than an animal story, more than a historical curiosity. The question is about what we owe to the creatures who choose us, not the ones we choose, the ones who choose us. Antis chose Václav in the ruins of that farmhouse in France with the same completeness that any choice can have, which is to say, without reservation and without condition. He did not choose a version of Václav that was well-fed and safe and stationed far from the bombs. He chose the actual Václav, the one with the dangerous job and the long absences and the tendency to be found under rubble. He chose the version that required crossing borders in the dark and breathing through a custom-engineered mask at 15,000 feet. He chose all of it, every time, without qualification. What do we owe to a creature who makes that choice? The answer, Václav Božděch's life suggests, is everything you can give. It is the risk of court-martial for refusing to leave them behind. It is the custom oxygen mask. It is the burial with military honors. It is the refusal to let the story be forgotten, the insistence that the record should show that he was there, that he served, that what he did was real. The Dickin Medal is a piece of metal and a strip of ribbon. What it represents is the institutional admission that some forms of loyalty defy the categories we use to organize the world. Antis could not be a soldier. He was not human. He did not understand the politics of the war, the ideology of the occupation, the cartography of the borders he crossed. He understood Václav. He understood that Václav was worth finding in the rubble and worth leading through the forest and worth bleeding quietly for in the back of a burning aircraft above Germany. That understanding, that specific orientation of everything he had toward a single human being was not less than what the men around him were doing. It was, in its own register, exactly the same thing. Wars end. The borders that were crossed in the dark become, eventually, just borders. The aircraft that flew the missions become museum pieces, their geodetic structures preserved behind glass for people who were not alive when they were terrifying. The men who flew in them age and die and become history, their faces in photographs becoming increasingly remote from the faces of people walking past them in archives and exhibitions. The dogs who flew with them age faster, because that is the specific cruelty of the arrangement, that they are given everything we have and then they leave first. Antis lived 13 years, which in the currency of a dog's life is long and full. He spent those 13 years in the company of the one person who had carried him across no man's land in a military jacket, who had hidden him under a pile of coats on an evacuation ship, who had commissioned a custom oxygen mask for his muzzle, who had refused every institutional attempt to separate them. He died, presumably, knowing exactly what he was and where he belonged, because he always had. Some animals are like that. Some animals come into a life and fill a space in it so completely that the space remains after they are gone, visible in the negative, in the shape of the absence. Václav lived until 1980. He outlived Antis by 27 years, which is a long time to carry a specific absence. What kept him company in those years we cannot know. But we know what he had said, in his own words, recorded by Richardson, that the dog had been, across all the upheaval and the loss and the crossing of borders, the one constant, the one thing that had stayed. I don't have a word in English that is adequate to that. I suspect it exists in Czech, in the way that languages sometimes have words for the exact shape of a specific experience that other languages can only approximate. But the shape of it is clear. Two creatures found in the ruins of a farm in the winter of 1940, choosing each other without reservation across 13 years of war and occupation and escape and memory. That is the shape of it. That is the whole of it. If this story moved you, if it changed something in the way you see the creatures who share your life, leave a comment. Tell me about your dog, your cat, your horse, the animal who chose you, and what you did with that choice. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, because the archive of animals who flew and fought and found the living in the rubble is longer than most people know, and every one of those stories deserves to be told in full. There is a dog named Judy, and a pigeon named Cher Ami, and a bear named Wojtek who carried artillery shells in the Italian campaign, and drank beer and wrestled with soldiers, and became a corporal in the Polish army. There is enough here for a long time. Stay with me for it.